Hey, everybody. So yeah, that information is slightly outdated. So I actually got my PhD. So I'm working at JuliaHub now as a software engineer. But this package was, yeah, this is something that was born last year after my PhD when I had a little bit of time. Fortunately, well, something I want to acknowledge here is the Julia non-focus grants as well, which sort of funded this project. So I'm really grateful for that. And yeah, so MarkdownAST is a tiny interface package for Markdown documents. And some of you may know I also dabble with Documenter.jl, and so I want to motivate this package. Like the motivation of this package came from Documenter.jl, so I'm gonna explain the motivation of the package through Documenter. So if you know Documenter, it's a static. Well, if you don't know Documenter, it's a static site generator that we use to generate the manual of the Julia manual, and a bunch of packages are using it as well. And in a nutshell, how it works is it takes a bunch of Markdown. You have your doc strings in your Julia code, and you have external Markdown files, right? And they get combined into the manual. That's what Documenter does for you. Technically, how it works is, yeah, it takes the Markdown. You first have to parse the Markdown into some sort of a Julia data structure, which currently we use the Markdown standard library that you have in that ships with Julia. That has a sort of a type of representation of Markdown. And then Documenter takes that and does a bunch of processing on that. You end up with actually sort of a different representation of so the type of processing that the document does is the example blocks get, it evaluates code and does all those things and cross references, resolves them for you and all that stuff. And then you end up with a different kind of representation of the document, which then gets passed on to sort of writer modules. Now, practically HTML and PDF are actually part of Documenter, but for the purposes of this illustration, think of them as a separate step that comes after Documenter. And now, this is fine. This is perfectly fine, this flow, but you want to do sort of more things with Documenter, hopefully. One thing you may want to do is some form of generated documentation. Let's say you just want to generate some sort of page. It's not a static Markdown thing. It's something, for example, generated. One example of generated documentation is using literate.jl package, which basically can take those sort of Julia scripts which have a bunch of comments, and it turns them into documents. The comments become the Markdown prose, and then the actual code becomes sort of the code blocks or the example blocks. The way literate technically works right now is it actually turns those Julia scripts into Markdown files. Those get then parsed, and that's how they end up in Documenter. But that's a little bit limiting because you have to actually produce Markdown, which means you have to think about how to represent everything and using sort of in the Markdown syntax, and also you're limited to what Markdown can do for you. So maybe we can do better there. Another practical example is well, what if we now have some other format that we want to ingest into Documenter? Could be something like restructured text, but actually a very practical example is using Common Mark or GitHub flavor Markdown, because the Julia Markdown that we normally use is not the same as what you use on GitHub. There are differences, and this is the reason why if you try to load your standard README of your package README into Documenter, it doesn't actually look very nice because you're probably using some features of GitHub flavored Markdown that are not supported by the Julia parser. We do have a package in Julia called commonmark.jl, which can parse those things, but it has a different representation of the document, so Documenter has to add a support for a different representation when it starts combining all of these things together. What I would love, or what MarkdownAST actually does now, and Documenter, it has not been released yet, but on Documenter Master, it actually uses MarkdownAST internally. We take Documenter out from the middle and replace it with a standard representation, which is the MarkdownAST. And then things become much simpler. So if you want to have any extra formats, they become you just have to represent them in MarkdownAST, and then you can pass that to Documenter. Another example is, so if you have any generated documentation, you can generate the MarkdownAST of it, and it will become, and you can just pass that to Documenter. And then, Documenter takes the MarkdownAST, actually passes that back out, and then the writer modules can also use MarkdownAST. Everything is standardized, sort of documented. And so you have this nice interface now, rather than sort of ad hoc representations of these Markdown documents. Yeah. So what is the so briefly, like, what is the actual representation, or how does MarkdownAST actually work? So if you do have a Markdown document, then well, if you're into computer science and parsers and stuff, and you know what an abstract syntax tree is, then you probably have a very good idea already what MarkdownAST does. But you can take a Markdown document and think of it as a tree. So this sort of document you could sort of think of it, it's a tree like this. So overall, it's like the root node sort of it's a document, and then you have like the top level elements, which is like the headings and a couple of paragraphs, but the paragraphs themselves are like sequences of like text, length text, and so on. So you get a tree kind of structure. So the natural data structure we want to use in Julia would be some form of tree. And yeah, so quickly just to show the implementation, you have the node type, which so there is a type stable. So this provides type stability. So each of these nodes on the tree, once it's sort of been parsed, will be represented by a node type, and that contains all the information about like how to connect the different nodes together. So you can traverse the whole tree, and it's a single type, so it's type stable. This is an improvement over the representation that's in the Markdown standard library, where things are sort of stored in vector any's all over the place, and it's extremely type unstable, and there are also no rules, and like the fields are kind of randomly named, and so it's actually pretty annoying to traverse the whole Markdown tree using the standard library. What MarkdownAST provides is so it has a bunch of methods and stuff that you can now use to work with these trees. Mostly to like modify, you may want to like say move around the paragraph or something like that. You can do that with MarkdownAST. It also supports the AbstractTrees interface. So if you want to traverse trees, you would actually use the pre-order DFS and all those algorithms that are in MarkdownAST. Oh, sorry, in AbstractTrees. The other part, the second pillar sort of in MarkdownAST are the elements. So every node has to have some sort of semantic meaning, right? So it's either a paragraph, it's either a link, text, whatever. So you will have the element field of every node contains all that semantic information, the contents of the code block, the language of the code block, all that information will be in an element, which is just going to be a Julia object attached to each of these nodes. So yeah, that's all basically. That's all I have. So my hope here, this is meant to be as a sort of a small advertisement. So if this piques your interest, please do get in touch. The package is obviously available in GitHub and in general and so on and so forth. My sort of long-term hope here is like short-term, it's already being used in Documenter. If at some point you may like, if you write any Documenter plugins or that kind of stuff, you probably have to deal with MarkdownAST. In the long term, though, if you work with any sort of documents that you want to like pass them around between different packages and that kind of stuff, so I do hope that this package could become the sort of the standard representation that we would use in the Julia ecosystem. So that's my hope in the long term. All right, I think that's all for me. So thank you.
Questions? You had in one of the first slides that the documenter can also output the
Yeah.
Is that the case already?
Yeah, so the question is there actually an EPUB output? So Documenter doesn't do that, but there is actually a package, like someone else is maintaining a package. I haven't really checked in on it. It was created a while back. So at least at some point there was an EPUB output for that. I don't know how well it works, but something exists.
Can you do footnoting now?
Question is, can we do footnotes? Footnotes are supported in the standard Julia Markdown, actually. So they've been there since the beginning.
Reference things in the text. I'll explain what I mean. When you have a link and then you have just a reference to the link, but you put a list of links at the bottom of the Markdown, like a high text thing.
You can do arbitrary footnotes, so like you can have a small block of text that is, and that has a small footnote label, and it'll jump down to the bottom of the page. So that actually does exist. And there's also a separate package that recently got a lot of motion, which is the documentary citations, I think, which handles citations as sort of footnotes as well. But that's not quite the same thing, but that's also a cool package.